Welcome to Next in Tech, an S&P Global Market Intelligence podcast where the world of emerging tech lives. I'm your host, Eric Hanselman, Chief Analyst for Technology, Media, and Telecom at S&P Global Market Intelligence. And today, we're going to be discussing supply chain technology with returning guests, Eric Johnson, the Senior Tech Editor at the Journal of Commerce, and Mark Fontecchio, an analyst on the TMT team. Welcome back to both of you.
Thanks for having us, Eric.
Yeah, great to be back, Eric.
It's great to have you. We're going to be talking about some recaps on what was taking place at a couple conferences, TPM and the associated TPM Tech, and a lot of the technology that's there. And Eric, when you were on last, we were talking a lot about supply chain technology and some of the things that the pandemic certainly brought to the fore. But there's been a lot that's been going on in terms of the technology that's coming into play. And Mark, you've actually been managing a study that's looking at a lot of data that was actually shown at the conferences as well. I guess I want to start out with pieces that are looking at what's really driving digitization in logistics and supply chain. And there's it's a big and sprawling industry. There's a lot that's going on, but you've been doing a lot of study work to really figure out what are some of the dynamics that are in play.
Yeah, sure. So maybe it would help if I started off with an overview of the study, the survey that we did. So it was a global survey of about 500 enterprise IT and OT decision makers in the shipping and logistics industry. And there were three different kinds of companies we surveyed in the industry. The first were shippers. So these are often called beneficial cargo owners or BCOs. And they're the companies that are looking to ship goods from one location to another. Include major retailers like Walmart or your automakers like General Motors, pharmaceutical companies, etc. The second type of company we surveyed are the carriers, and they do what their name implies. They do the actual carrying or transporting of goods via road, rail, ocean, and air. They include your major trucking companies, railroad companies, ocean shippers like Maersk, air freight organizations. And then the third are the logistics service providers. So they serve as something of a middleman between the two, helping shippers to schedule, book, and manage the shipment of their goods. They include companies that are described as freight forwarders, 3PLs, and freight brokers. So that's kind of an overview of the survey. It was fielded in November and December, and we have the results in. We asked them a lot of questions around their digital transformation strategies and plans, what their digital transformation budgets were, some of the drivers, challenges, and then about specific projects like use case projects that they have in production now or plan to deploy in the future. So that's kind of an overview of the survey. And what's driving digitization, I think I can kind of give you some general overview results of the survey. So we found that 2/3 of them say that they have a formal digital transformation strategy in place. And so Eric can kind of speak to this too. I think we were both a bit surprised that it was that high. The industry, I think, has a reputation of being somewhat tech averse or at least cautious to adopt new technology. And some of that is just because they've been doing it a certain way for many decades and it's worked well enough. I would say that had started to change before the pandemic, but kind of went into a different gear because of the pandemic. And so more organizations are kind of looking to technology to fix some of the issues, some of the supply chain disruptions and issues that we saw highlighted during the pandemic. I think you have some of that going on. You also have what digital transformation means, right? So it's kind of a somewhat vague definition. We tried to define it a little bit more specifically in the survey by saying that it means the digitization of business processes, but it still allows some wiggle room for enterprises to, digital transformation for them could be the complete overhaul of their business processes so they're completely digitized, or it could be just buying software, a certain software from a vendor and then saying, yeah, we have digital transformation. So I think that's some of it too. And then some of it might just be aspirational, like these organizations just feel like they need to be adopting digital transformation. And so they're kind of saying that they are, when they plan to in the future. There's something like that.
Well, and saying that they have a strategy in place is not necessarily indicating that they're actually implementing it. Because Eric, when you were on last, you're identifying this is a business that, or these are a set of businesses that really have been relying on the lowest common denominator for information exchange. This is a lot gets done on spreadsheets because you know that the counterparties you're working with are actually going to be able to deal with that. And that in fact, that lowest common denominator may help smooth interactions, even though it's holding back the kinds of work that you could do and the kind of efficiencies you might actually be able to achieve with something better.
100%. When I think about the term digital transformation, it's such as Mark said, it's such a malleable term depending on who is sort of considering it and whether they, how they are answering the question that Mark posed in the survey.
Vague and overhyped terms in technology? How unusual.
I know, exactly. I sort of joke internally at the Journal of Commerce that I have like the squishiest, beat. Everybody else is like, well, there's this much capacity and we booked this much. And me, it's like, well, digital transformation and visibility and all these other terms, they mean 100 different things to 100 people. So, but with that said, you're right. And Mark is right that this sort of change was happening pre-pandemic and got accelerated during the pandemic. But everybody was realizing that the process that they used for booking freight, for making sure that freight was moving as it was supposed to be, for paying for freight, all of those individual processes were good enough. But I think of digital transformation as these companies realizing there's data that's associated with each of these individual discrete processes. And if you have a structure around that, if you have a system that helps you structure that a little more, you can start to make it not just a process that sort of evaporates into the ether as soon as it's done, but you can start to measure things a little bit better. And so for me, I see digital transformation aspirations as a proxy for a company just having a better handle on their end-to-end processes, as opposed to just treating everything as like a transaction to be sort of left behind and then on to the next. And I think one other thing I'll highlight, and I'm sure, Mark can maybe go into this in terms of the different attitudes toward this based on the segments that he talked about. I think one thing that's really interesting for me to think about as I write about this industry and as I look at, research that Mark did is the service providers. So those 3PLs that he talked about, they're in a position where they can channel all or at least most of their investment into software straight into their business, because their business is a service business. They're serving the shippers, the cargo owners, and they're serving the carriers, the capacity providers in some way, or they're partnering with them. The shipper, the cargo owners, you think of a Walmart or a big like conglomerate, industrial conglomerate. Logistics software is one of 30 or 50 different areas that they need to invest in from a software perspective. And the question is, how big a priority is it within that broader organization? So digital transformation is always going to be a bigger deal to the service providers than it is to the companies that are being provided a service, with some anomalies where you have companies on the shipper side that are prioritizing investment in their logistics or supply chain function way above what the sort of baseline is doing.
Well, I mean, and Mark, you had broken this down into three principal classes within the study respondents, but in none of these areas are these really monolithic industries. I mean, there's a lot of differentiation between the different aspects, even within each of these segments.
Oh, yeah. The survey data is split up. There's a lot of different data cuts. But yeah, I mean, just within and we did that on purpose too. I mean, just within shippers, we split that up within industry too. So we have various shippers from different industries: manufacturing, healthcare, government, retail. That way we could kind of get even deeper into, the needs and the drivers and the challenges from each of those types of shippers. So yeah, there's a lot of ways, and then you can talk about the geographical split as well. So, or you could talk about the size of the companies. So, for example, we found that the larger companies in general, the ones with more than 1,000 employees, more than $1 billion in revenue, tend to be undergoing digital transformation at a much higher rate than the smaller companies. And then shippers tend to say anyways that they're undergoing digital transformation at much higher rates than, say, the carriers. So yeah, there's a bunch of ways to split that data and look at it and find insights.
Interesting. So within that, what do you see as some of the biggest hurdles?
I would say far and away, and this is pretty much across every segment, the skills and people shortage was far and away the number one hurdle for everyone. And I think that makes sense. We kind of mentioned earlier how the pandemic accelerated digital transformation in supply chain and shipping and logistics. And so, as these companies moved to swiftly upgrade their products, some ran into a wall. Who could do it? Where could they find the people who knew how to do it? How would they compete with other organizations that were looking to do the same? So that's why I think that the skills and people shortage was far and away the number one hurdle. I think it was 4 in 10 organizations said that, and the next in line was, I think it was 17%, which was legacy mindset, was another hurdle, which is that's pretty significant too. But the number one was by far the skills and people shortage.
A traditional problem and an ongoing one in tech broadly, right?
Yeah, for sure. And the other kind of interesting insight, and I talked to Eric about this offline at another point, which was that, one of the things that you're seeing from shippers, which is kind of related to it, is a lot of them are outsourcing their technology. So they're looking for help. They're looking for help from these logistics service providers and other technology service providers to outsource some of their technology needs and some of their digital transformation needs. I believe it was about 7 in 10 shippers said that they're outsourcing, some form of their technology. So yeah, it's definitely an issue.
And Eric, that's one of those things that you've seen and actually deal a lot with at the JOC, yeah?
Yeah, for sure. I would say those two findings marry really well with kind of qualitative discussions that I have on a regular basis, and for different reasons. The skill shortage is really interesting, and I'm really appreciative that Mark was able to sort of quantify that, because what we've seen in logistics is a very big change in terms of the needs of organizations versus the typical people that they would have recruited at an entry level position to join the business. So traditionally, logistics has been, especially global logistics, has been a very people intensive business. There's a lot of data entry. There's a lot of documents and data that have to move from one company's system to another company's, or even within two systems in the same company. And generally, people have been the mechanism to make that happen. And so you see a lot of people sort of start in this industry doing data entry or, kind of processing documents at some level, doing like phone call checks on where cargo is, right? Like basic stuff in our industry, not the most challenging stuff, but that's sort of paying your dues. And then you slowly move up and you matriculate into leadership role after you've done it for a while. Well, as companies adopt more systems and the technology advances, there's really a huge hunger. I mean, this is what I hear, and the research that Mark did bears this out. There's really a hunger for people who can figure out what data means and people who can figure out how to clean data so it's more usable and readable and digestible for people or systems. And, we sort of flipped a switch on that pretty quickly. And it's not like the pool of potential employees that are coming into the industry necessarily flipped at that same level. Like not everyone with a computer science degree is naturally going, oh, I need to go into logistics, right? So there's going to be a gap, I think, for a while that persists because of that, how quickly the needs of the organizations have changed relative to whether, the people that are qualified to do those jobs are actually attracted to the logistics industry, especially as, things have kind of calmed down and it's not on the front pages of the newspaper and websites anymore. On the outsourcing side, this is sort of an ongoing dynamic that I cover where shippers, I think, innately want to control as much as they can, but they tend to realize very quickly that there's a lot of stuff that they're not terribly proficient in, or they don't have the resources to manage. And that's why every single shipper uses a 3PL for something. There's very, very, very few shippers, if any, that don't have any 3PL engagement. So they're all using them for something. The question is, are they using them to do those sort of like human intensive tasks, booking space on a ship, moving data from one system to another? Or are they starting to use technology to do that? And either way, it makes more sense in most cases for a shipper to say, our core competency is not moving data from one system to another or building a system that moves data from one system to another. It's making a product or designing a product or whatever their proficiency is on the actual thing that they sell. So this is a forever kind of dynamic. The question is, right now, I think we're seeing why those numbers were so stark in Mark's study about how many shippers are looking for technology from their 3PLs is external dynamics in the market are so intense right now. It's really hard to keep pace with what's going on, along with building tech to like overcome those dynamics or sort of ride the waves of those dynamics on the external side. It just makes more sense to hand that off to a 3PL that's purely looking at that 100% of the time and not worrying about making a product, right? So I'm not at all surprised to see those numbers, but it's great to have like actual quantitative numbers instead of qualitative discussions.
Well, but you make a really important point, which is the fact that we flipped this switch from the availability of technology and a lot of tech-heavy approaches, but yet we're working in an industry that hasn't been tech-heavy, from the outset, and now faces a lot of those hurdles. And Mark, your data was saying this is one of those institutional resistance issues of the fact that, hey, we got systems that are working, we don't want to break anything. I mean, it's that challenge, I think, that here you've got shipping and logistics as being what is the quintessential edge use case, all those buzzy things we talk about with edge. And yet we've got some fairly significant issues leveraging edge in order to actually capitalize on the kinds of things that it could do.
Yeah, I think Eric's point, which was a good one about how things have kind of calmed down in the supply chain, or at least it's not on the front page of the Wall Street Journal every day.
As often.
Yeah, as often, all the supply chain disruptions and everything like that. It will be very interesting to see if that sort of accelerated pace of digital transformation kind of stays up on a plateau and stays kind of high, that adoption stays high and continues and maybe even, increases more, or if it just kind of maybe levels out or even goes down some because there isn't sort of that kick from the public or from the media or just from things going on that the pandemic sort of helped push some of these organizations into digital transformation. So it'll be interesting to see going forward if that increase in digital transformation will, kind of continue to happen or if it will sort of level out.
Well, these are a lot of the things you've been talking here about at TPM Tech. And I guess actually we can touch base on the conference. I mean, what is it? Eric, you mentioned a little bit about it when last you were on, but can you give us some details about really what was going on at the conference and the nature of the beast itself?
Yeah, so this was the second year we held TPM Tech, which is sort of a pre-conference before a much larger event called TPM was in its it started in 2001, I believe. So this is the 23rd year, notwithstanding the COVID cancellation in 2020 and a virtual version in 21. But it has become an institution in the sort of global logistics industry and container shipping industry. TPM Tech was designed to sort of be a place where it was safe to talk about technology investment and strategy over a longer period of time. That was sort of confined away from the traditional discussions at the bigger event, which tend to focus on kind of commercial relationships between the cargo owners and shippers we've talked about and carriers and forwarders who are mostly interested in making sure they have enough space at the right price over the next year to move all their goods.
Primarily business conversations
That's
on
right.
the TPM side.
That's right. And so tech is, hey, let's look 5 years out. What do we need? What are the pieces of software or the software vendors that we need to be partnering with to make sure that we are not essentially losing pace with our competitors, right? It's a bell curve, right? There's some that are independently looking out and saying, this is where we need to be, and we don't care where the rest of the industry is. And then there's a lot, but the sort of fat middle of the bell is still looking over their shoulder going, I just want to keep pace. I want to make sure I'm aware of what's out in the market. I want to know what is available versus the pain points that I know that we struggle with, or a system that we know is way outdated, including maybe spreadsheets. So that's, for me, the ethos of tech is really like helping people refine their framework for what and where they need to invest whatever paltry budget they have on the logistics technology side. So that, because they may not, it may be another 2 to 5 years before they get another chance to invest in something. So they have to get it right. There's not a lot of excess budget to address these things. So, and it's a really confusing landscape. So my goal every year is that people come out of this with just a sort of a sense of clarity about where they need to go. And, it feels like that was the outcome this year as well.
Well, and we know from a quantitative perspective that, hey, there's aspiration for the transformation journey. So hopefully that's something that they're able to take away from TPM Tech and actually start to now put into place post-conference.
It's an interesting crowd at tech because it's, we talk about technology issues at TPM, but it can be kind of a peripheral conversation relative to what I just mentioned about kind of commercial negotiations. At TPM Tech, it's very much a self-selecting crowd, right? These are people taking extra time out of an already busy week and really focusing sort of intently on these types of discussions. So in some sense, it's sort of the group in Mark's survey that is indicating they are, going down this road. They are not just starting out necessarily. They are knee deep in this, and they need to get really smart about a bunch of different software categories in 2 days.
Yeah, it's kind of funny you mentioned that, Eric, how the crowd is self-selecting, and that's so true. It's almost like a lot of the people who don't go to TPM Tech should maybe be the ones who are going to it. So I'm sure that's a kind of an ongoing challenge trying to get people there.
Yeah,
right?
that's true. I've thought about that. Yep.
And again, another classic problem that we often face, which is that the folks who maybe need this the most are those that are maybe still pretty reticent about diving in. But I mean, Eric, as you were saying, it is a situation where you got a lot of the industry sort of looking over their shoulders, working to stay competitive, but also trying to manage what they can do from an investment perspective and from a transformational perspective.
One follow-up, I think, that relates to TPM Tech and the discussions there that relates to what you guys were talking about in terms of the prominence of supply chain today versus maybe a year ago or even 6 months ago, is I sort of think of it like, especially on the shipper side, I think of it sort of like the way any sort of White House administration might deal with something, right? So the White House has a million different things it could be focusing on any given day. It generally tends to focus on things that are making a lot of news, or it wants to get out in front of, so to appear to be kind of tackling, right? And one of those things was supply chain last year, right? So we saw a bunch of initiatives that the White House and the federal government, including some new shipping law that was the first time shipping laws had been rewritten in something like 25 years. And I think big multinational shippers are the same way, right? You can focus on 100 different things on any given day. And last year it was, the CEO was having regular conversations with the chief supply chain officer or even the director of international transportation. That was an everyday conversation because they couldn't get product on the shelf when they needed it, or they couldn't get it, a component into a factory when they needed it. The question, as Mark put it, is, will there be remnants of that, desperation that kind of carry forward and translate into investment into technology, even as the desperation has receded, right? Like those calls are not happening on a daily basis anymore. They may be happening now weekly or monthly, but the question is, does that episode, that sort of like emergency room episode from last year, does that say, oh, I actually need to exercise a little bit every day? I need to do my logistics, like honing in on my logistics part of my business a little more than we were pre-pandemic.
Well, as the New Year's resolutions fade, right?
That's right. That's right. Yep.
Well, I guess we'll have to see in the next round of data where this goes and whether or not a lot of those aspirations around transformation have actually borne themselves out. But this has been great. I appreciate all the perspectives from both of you. Thank you.
You're welcome. Again, thanks for having us.
Yeah, glad to be back here.
And that is it for this episode of Next in Tech. Thanks to our audience for staying with us. And thanks to our production team, including Carolyn Wright, Ethan Zimmon, and Syed Waji Abbas on the marketing and events teams, and our studio lead, Kyle Camulosi. I hope you'll join us for our next episode, where we're going to be looking at everything that's been going on at the Mobile World Congress, another mega conference that's taking place, to dig into what's taking place there from both the telco traditions from where they've started, as well as everything that Mobile World Congress has branched out into. I hope you'll join us then, because there is always something next in tech.